Hi, my name's Wes, and what I'd like to do today is just discuss poisoning the well of knowledge in the form of anchoring. It's a very common form used, and so what I'd like to do is just go over some points and just kind of see if there's any discussion to be had, or if there's any questions, or just whatever. If you disagree with me, definitely leave comments. Explain to me why I'm wrong. I'd love to hear it. Anyway, so on to anchoring. Anchoring is a process in which you give basically a person a piece of information that is intended to alter their perception of a proposition. So in sales is where we most commonly encounter this. You'll go down the supermarket aisle and you'll see 10% off this, 20% off that, and sometimes, 30% or 50% or whatever you want, whatever percentage. But this is supposed to tell you that this is a good deal to buy. And this is a form of anchoring. It's a very common form. Just because something is discounted doesn't mean it's a good deal. So maybe that box of, cornflakes that's 50% off is already expired. And so it's stale. It's something they just can't sell off the shelves, and so that's why it's on discount. So you're going to get a substandard product. This is what they mean by anchoring. Anchoring is meant to attract your attention to believe something is good based on your cognitive bias. A percentage off sounds good to you. You're naturally prone to believe that that's actually a good deal unless you take the time to do the math, right? Or you take the time to check the fresh date or whatever you do to break up the bias of, oh, that's a good deal. And so there's two sides to anchoring. The first is an anchor is only usable if it gives you a proposition you find not too far out of the bounds of acceptance. So if a proposition doesn't sound too crazy to believe, an anchor put before it can sway your decision. So what are some common apologetics that rely on anchoring? Well, the first one I'd have to say is something can't come from nothing. Yes, it is an argument from ignorance, but it's relying on an anchor. And the anchor isn't to refute the argument of the Big Bang, right? They're not refuting the Big Bang with this because their version of nothing in this, in order for that to be accurate, would have to be absolutely nothing. But the apologist just says something can't come from nothing. What he's really not telling the audience is there's a difference between the way he's saying nothing and the way nothing is used in science. Now, William Lane Craig made this popular, and usually he'll start off by saying something can't come from nothing, kind of get a chuckle, and then he'll say, well, when in science, when they say nothing, they mean something. And that's actually wrong too. Science doesn't mean nothing is absolutely nothing or something. It just means it's something we haven't quantified properties for, or it's nothing we've quantified properties for. Therefore, we make no conclusions, no predictions, or no assumptions of what it is. And that's how science defines nothing. And the other thing that's kind of funny and hilarious at the same time is William Lane Craig's version of God would fit in that definition of nothing. And yet, they're dismissing it out of hand, which almost makes it a ridiculous statement with a ridiculous conclusion. Now, I realize for the believer, they believe in a God. Therefore, proposing a God as an answer isn't a ridiculous proposal. Therefore, the anchor is convincing to a believer more likely than it will be to a non-believer. And this is what I mean by apologetics are just using anchors in a way to bias the conversation. This is a poisoning of the well of knowledge. Now, if he had just said at the very beginning, well, science, when they say nothing, doesn't mean nothing. It just means they don't know if it is anything or not. And then he said something can't come from nothing. You'd probably think about that for a second and go, wait, something's wrong there. That conclusion doesn't make sense with your current definition of nothing. And so I just want you to understand, this is how apologetics seem to be going for theists. And I think it's dishonest, and I think it's also definitely shows that the apologists don't think theists are very smart. So it's not necessarily a criticism of the theist, it's more a criticism of the apologist. Proper apologetics is supposed to be a poignant response. In other words, it's supposed to be a correct response to the proposal. And this is not. So if you're going to argue against the Big Bang, you would actually argue against what it proposes, not just say something can't come from nothing, ha ha. The second one is a different argument, but I hear this a lot more now because it's just so absurd. And I think it's almost a gish gallop at this point. And what I mean by a gish gallop is there's so many things wrong with this that to properly refute it, it would seem like it would take forever. But basically, here's what goes on. The laws of logic require an absolute creator for their existence. Now, let me explain. That's my short of what Max Slick says. Basically, he says since the laws of logic are absolute, they require an absolute creator for their existence. The first problem is he's assuming they are absolute. They may in fact be absolute. However, humans, we are incapable of determining anything as absolute. We don't have the knowledge to know that something always is and is never not in all of reality. Think about that. If any proposal you could make, could you know that it is 100%, that it always is and is never not, no matter where you are in the universe? And that's the thing. We don't know enough about the universe to propose anything as absolute. And so this is important to remember. So his first premise, the laws of logic are absolute, is already a fallacious claim. We don't know if they are. They could be, but we don't know. His second is they require an absolute creator for their existence, because an absolute creator would be capable of creating an absolute. Now, there's a lot of mistakes in there again. Number one, he's again claiming to know absolutes. This should be your biggest red flag or, okay, this is just dumb argument. Because he's again claiming to have knowledge something is absolute. When a theist says their God is absolute, I don't even know how you could know that. How do you know that your God exists no matter where you are in the universe? How do you have knowledge that your God is anywhere even exists within reality beyond just you feel it does? And so that's the first problem with this, is it becomes extremely fallacious to assume your God has the properties to fulfill the question. And this is called the God of the gaps a lot of times. And again, these are all just different forms of poisoning the well of knowledge. For the non-believer, this isn't convincing. As you can clearly see, I'm definitely just easily knocking it down and going, well, doesn't make any sense here. There's problems here. But I want to be fair to the believer. Okay, for the believer, again, God isn't an out-of-bounds proposition. So, saying that God is the reason for the laws of logic, the believer doesn't necessarily think that's crazy or think that that's something that could not be true. As much as I understand why you believe it due to your cognitive biases because you believe in a God, I don't necessarily agree that you have any knowledge that could know that that is true. And so that's where I would take issue with anybody proposing this as an answer for anything. So, as I said, the anchors are generally for people who are predisposed to believe in a God. And this is why they use a nebulous God when apologists answer. You don't hear William Lane Craig arguing for Yahweh. He never does. He always just says God, or he always uses a nebulous God. And this is actually another form of muddying the waters. Basically what he's trying to do is by dragging in all the gods at once, by just saying God, he's making his God non-falsifiable. If he says Yahweh is the one who created these, now he's taken on a much larger burden of proof. He still takes on a burden of proof claiming a God did, but Yahweh in particular, how could you know the God's name is Yahweh? How could you know that Yahweh is actually even a God that could exist? How could you know that Yahweh is absolute? And so tons and tons of questions. How is Yahweh the only answer and not Allah or any of these other gods that fit the same properties? And that's the thing that this is the reason why they avoid that. Because they know that in the end, if they get too specific with their God or they try to specify their claims, they could possibly make them falsifiable, which means science or investigation could demonstrate them to be completely fallacious, which for apologists probably is a death knell. You know, it's basically going to ruin their career, because if they're just shown to be making wild claims and they don't know what they're talking about, then they just kind of fall to the wayside. But they don't really with believers. And I think it has to do with the anchors. And I'll explain what I mean by they don't really with the believers. Take Peter Popov or take Jim Baker or any of these other people who've been proven to be frauds. They're still out there, they're still selling to Christians, and they're still making money, and people are still buying and believing what they're telling them. And that has to all do with the anchors that have been reinforced. The time they're in church, from the time they're with friends, you name it. Anytime anybody adds another weight to the anchor, it makes that anchor harder for the believer to let go, because they have more reason to believe the anchor. I'm not going to say it's good reasoning or bad reason. I'm just going to say you can have a lot of bad reasons to believe in something and hold it as a belief, even in the face of evidence. So this is how anchoring is a poisoning the well of knowledge. You're basically using the anchors of the believer to invalidate the questions. And so this is it's this constant attempt to shift away the burden of proof. So the apologist doesn't have to be the one to demonstrate what is true and what is false. So when should we confront anchors? Well, I think any time we can reasonably discuss why something is wrong with the other person, we should, as long as, like I said, as long as we can reasonably discuss. So if you're at work, and it might not be the best place for it, it depends on the person. If the person's agreeable and is not going to take offense to it, you might want to approach it, but you definitely want to approach it with caution, because even if it's somebody who, let's say you don't care whether or not they like you, it could still get you in a position where maybe of harassment or attacking a person in a way that's not safe for work, those type of things. You know what I mean? And so we don't want to harass people. We don't want to treat them poorly, but I do want to ask the question. I mean, what's some good ways to approach the anchors without necessarily attacking the individual? And if there's not really good ways to do this, what's the best ways to approach it? I'm going to provide some of the answers myself, but at the same time, I'm open to other options. So a couple I came up with was encourage their research the claims themselves. If the person is agreeable and not on the defense, offer up reasons why you're not convinced by the argument. I spelled you're wrong. Okay, now it's fixed. Look for mutual ground that you both agree upon. And last of all, the Socratic method. That's definitely one where instead of approaching it as this is why I disagree, instead go, why is that convincing for you? And once you kind of break down and understand why they're convinced, a lot of times you can explain why it's not convincing for you and come to a mutual ground where maybe they'll research it and either they'll believe it or they won't. It's that type of thing where just little seeds of doubt help. And I know that a lot of people are going to say it's probably a strange phrasing, but no, it's true. It's the seeds of doubt. You're planting a seed for them to question something so that if it is wrong, if it isn't something they should hold as a belief, hopefully they will find the information to find out that better reality and a better grasp of reality. And my name is Wes, and what I'd like to say again is thank you for listening. Hope to see you in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever. Just keep it peaceful. Thanks, and let me know if you like the new format, or if you think the old one's okay, as long as I kind of clean it up a little better. Thanks again. Hope to hear from you.